Everybody. I wanted to talk to you about your terms for this week. We're going to talk about sounds and imagery in poetry. This is something we'll do just a little bit of this week. We're going to add on some more concepts about this next week. So I try to do this in little bits because I find that students find hearing the sounds somewhat difficult in poetry. Here are the key terms we're going to cover this week. These are the terms that I want to see in your discussion board. So make sure that you're also keeping track of these on your term sheet. That's your study guide for the test over poetry. But these are the key ideas I want you to hold on to for this week. We're going to talk about imagery. The poems that I've chosen for this week use really beautiful, great, powerful imagery. So that's why I have chosen them. I also chose them because I think they're enjoyable reads. So I tried to choose poems I thought you would like. But imagery can be visual, so it can tell us what we're supposed to see. It can be auditory, so it can be what we hear as we read the poem. It can also be tactile, so what does the poem look like? What do we feel when we read this poem? So imagery is the impression that is being made, or the vision or image trying to be portrayed. One of the best poetic styles for imagery is haiku. Typically, what it's doing is trying to take a very specific moment. It's usually very, very tiny, very, very short, very, very small. And then the writer uses these just real powerful imagery to tell us, the feeling and the depth of that moment. Usually, haikus are done with 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, and usually they're two different images. So in the first and third lines, they're usually contrasting images, and then the center line, the 7-syllable line, is where the author draws some kind of connection between them. Okay, so usually the first and last lines are actually sort of competing or contrasting ideas. And then that center line draws some comparison that teaches us about life, makes connections between experiences that we may not have made before. So that's the beautiful thing about haiku. Tons of imagery in haiku, so that's a really, really great type of poem. Okay, so this week we're going to talk some about figurative language. The point of figurative language is to find a way to describe something that our readers may not have experienced by comparing it to things they may have. Okay, you should not take figurative language literally. If it's written literally, that's not figurative language, that's just imagery. And we also do it to emphasize the points that we're making. You've probably heard these terms before, but just in case you have not, metaphor is when we make a comparison that does not have a direct connection. Okay, so we don't use like or as. Whereas a simile, we're showing that there is a direct connection between the two, which is why we use like or as. Personification is when we give an inanimate object person qualities. So when we say the flag waves in the wind, well, the flag isn't actually waving, people wave. Okay. Or the bear smiled, or anything like that, where something that's not a person has some quality that people have. The last one you may not have heard of before, this may be new to you, and that's apostrophe. Apostrophe, besides the punctuation mark, is when we're addressing something or someone not actually present in the poem, or that we would not normally address. So this is when the persona of the poem is addressing someone or something that's not in the poem. So maybe they're addressing the reader, or they're addressing someone outside the poem. We call that apostrophe. So be on the lookout for that. There is some of that in the poems you'll read this week. Okay. So again, remember that figurative language should never be taken literally. This is where non-native speakers struggle with the English language, is we use figurative language and cliche and things like that all over our language. And if you're a non-native, English is not your first language, this is where those non-native speakers struggle. So remember that they are not to be taken literally. All right, so a little bit more figurative language. These are ones you may or may not have heard of. The first one is metonymy, and that's when we use the proper name of an object to represent something closely related to it. Okay, the idea of metonymy is when we use the White House to talk about the president. Okay, so when we use a proper name of something that represents something that's very closely related to it. Okay, that's probably one of the best examples is when we talk about the White House reports. Well, the White House itself isn't doing anything, but the president who lives in the White House does. Okay, paradox is when we have two ideas that seem to contradict, but they do actually make sense. Okay, this is different than an oxymoron because oxymorons tend to be just a couple of sentences. Paradox is when we have complete sentences that seem to contradict each other. Okay, be looking for that in poetry because that's fairly common. The last one is pun, also called paranomasia. And that's when we play with words. So for things that sound alike or maybe mean something similar. My daughter, who's 7, her favorite one is to say, "Mom, that's so punny." She means funny, right? But she says punny, so that's a pun, and she gets to use the word pun. She thinks she's very smart. So be on the lookout for puns. Any of these are just a different way to highlight a point we're trying to make. To draw, again, to make comparisons to things people may be familiar with, to describe things they might not be familiar with. So why do we do all this? Well, to make connections, to surprise our reader, because then we avoid that cliche, writing the same thing everybody's written. To draw their focus to it, because if we, use figurative language, they're much more likely to pay attention to it. To offer some kind of new perspective. This is true especially for something like haiku, where we're trying to relate two things that seem contrasting but actually have some kind of connection. To deepen our understanding of what the author is talking about, or just really to leave an impression on the reader, because those are the things that we remember the most is when there's really powerful language attached. So take a look at those. Okay, so we're going to dive just a little bit into sounds of poetry. We're going to spend more time on that next week, but some sounds you want to discuss. Alliteration is repeating consonant sounds. So you've heard these before, the Sally sells seashells by the seashore, right? Assonance is the same thing, but instead of repeating consonant sounds, it repeats vowel sounds. Okay, so if we're repeating the A's or the E's, then you have assonance rather than alliteration. That's the only difference. Okay, so rhyme is the repeating of two vowel sounds with a similar consonant following. Okay, so maybe you haven't spent much, you probably learned about rhyme, but you may not have learned what makes rhyme. What makes rhyme is when we have vowel sounds followed by a consonant sound. So when we have the A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y, that follows a consonant. Okay, that's where rhyme happens. So when you have exact rhyme, it's because the sounds are exactly the same. So say and may both end in AY. Okay. Slant rhyme is when the consonants are the same, but the vowels are a little bit different. So sometimes they could even be the same. It's just sometimes the way we say the vowels sound a little bit different. So if I say, I just lost my example. It was food and glued. Food and glued. So we get this kind of, they both rhyme, but they're imperfect rhyme because the vowels are different. Obviously food is OO and glued is UE. So the vowels are different, but they sound the same. End rhyme is when the rhyme comes at the end of the line. This is the one we're used to, that Dr. Seuss taught us, that the rhymes happen at the end of the line, okay? Internal rhyme is when the rhyme happens inside the line. So it's the same idea, it's just not always is the rhyme only at the end of the line. So be looking out for internal rhyme inside. The last one is words that look like they should rhyme, but they don't. Another example I can think of, so you have rough and dough. They both look the same, but they don't actually rhyme because we say them differently. Another example of that one is food and good. Well, they should rhyme, but they don't. So I rhyme is when they look like they should, but they don't actually when you say them. Okay, so there's some thoughts about rhyme. You're going to want to talk about those in your discussion board. And the poems that I picked this week, I picked so that you could practice these ideas of alliteration, assonance, and rhyme. So make sure that you focus on those in your discussion board post. All right, so those are the ideas I want you to focus on for this week. Remember, there are not quizzes. There is the discussion board, so make sure you jump in there, pick your poem, and share what you learned from it. All right, have a great week.